Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Headlines in History from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, where we digest the most important updates from the world of diplomacy and foreign policy and take a short dive into one of the most pressing issues of the day. Before we get into our deep dive, let's take a look at some of the biggest foreign policy trends that have been going on in the past few weeks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
All right, Tristen, how are you doing today, buddy?
Yeah, I'm doing well. It is, believe it or not, a sunny and a warm day here in Britain. And that is something that we've been waiting for an awful long time. And it certainly feels good.
Yeah, bottle that one up. Yeah, it's nice here. We're in the lovely 2 to 3 week period before it just becomes oppressively hot. So I'd like to, as well as you, like to bottle this little section of weather we got going on right now. But anyways, enough chit chat. We've got things to talk about. What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, we're going to be talking about the legacy that Pope Francis is leaving behind. And then we're going to delve in to the election results from Canada at time of recording. There are still a few writings that are too close to call, but nonetheless, we can talk about broadly what's happened. And then we'll be talking about J.D. Vance's recent trip to India before finally turning to our conversation about the upcoming Romanian election and what this means for Europe.
All right. Sounds good. I know you're chomping at the bit to get into the Canada stuff. But before we get there, we wanted to talk about the death of Pope Francis and sort of what that means writ large. Now, obviously, that has hugely symbolic meaning for the more than 1 billion Catholics around the world. And this is something that doesn't happen all that often, obviously, because it takes a person dying for the next one to get elected. So sometimes you have a number of those in a shorter time frame. And it's such a unique process of what happens. It's like a head of state passing away, with the funerals and the diplomacy around it and people showing up and the importance and symbolism tied to that. But then the, opaque, fascinating nature of the conclave. And I mean, they make movies about this stuff. So we know it's got some intrigue to it and everything. And who gets selected as Francis's successor is going to be important, because Francis did have a major legacy. In aspects of foreign affairs, he wasn't necessarily Pope John Paul II, who pushed back against communism and things like that, but he did play a fairly significant role, and popes do and can play a significant role in foreign policy from time to time. But yeah, it's an interesting thing from a foreign policy standpoint and just from a diplomatic standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in Rome last weekend, and it was extraordinary to be there during the period of mourning and during the funeral. Rome was transformed in so many ways. It was a moment for practicing Catholics of mourning, of reflection. And for those coming in for the funeral, it was, as we saw, a moment for the recognition of the place of the Catholic Church, of the papacy in international affairs, and a moment for diplomacy. I think, for me, the enduring moment, or perhaps more to the point, the enduring image of last weekend is of President Trump and President Zelensky sitting in two very simple chairs in grand, if not cavernous, St. Peter's Basilica, having a quiet, indeed an intimate chat. And, the visuality of diplomacy, I think, is one of the most important, if not understudied, dimensions of diplomacy as an institution. And there we saw it on full display. That was an evocative image. I saw in one paper on the weekend them even calling it the first miracle.
Yeah, let's see what comes from that conversation first.
Indeed, I think that might be putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, the image is powerful. And this is, for me, one of the things that Pope Francis was very good at. He really understood the visual diplomacy of the papacy and the symbolic and aesthetic power that the office of Pope, and indeed the institution of the papacy, can have to draw attention to issues. There was his visit in 2014 to Israel and to Palestine. And while there, he prayed at the wall separating Israel from the West Bank. A visually striking moment, drawing attention to the enduring separation and conflict. Then, of course, there was his visit in 2016 at the height of the migrant crisis in Europe when he visited the Greek island of Lesbos. And in returning to the Vatican, he brought 12 migrants back with him, drawing attention to the migrant issue in a profoundly performative visual way, in a way that didn't just point towards the issue, but rather invited that mercy and empathy be directed towards it. And that, for me, is from the standpoint of the Pope or the papacy's role in diplomacy. I think this is one of the things that Francis really led on and really got right.
Yeah, he was a strong advocate for immigrants and those that are being forced out of their homes and trying to find a better life. And, even pushing back against the Trump administration on their stance towards that. And as the papacy goes, very progressive. And it will be interesting to see who gets elected. I fear in some ways that we won't have strong leadership for the coming months or years out of the papacy on these foreign policy issues, because there has been this sort of tug of war between progressive elements and conservative elements within the College of Cardinals and the Vatican City and the Catholic Church. So who gets elected, I think, is going to be spending some time sort of solidifying their role as the new Pope and sort of dealing with those more basic of sort of Catholic issues, I think. But that will be, I think, to the detriment of the rest of us in international affairs to some extent, but we'll see. Turning to the election up north, which happened last night as of recording of this podcast. Tristen, we've talked about this before, the importance of this election, the crazy back and forth of the polls because of what's going on in America and because of what the Trump administration was saying. So as of Tuesday morning, April 29th, the day after the election in Canada, where are
Well, this was an historic election. And simply put, as of the time of recording, the Liberals are projected to form the next government. They are just shy right now of forming a majority. There are still some ridings or constituencies which are too close to call. So it's tough to say whether or not right now they'll make it over the line. But I think what really matters here is that even just a few months ago, it was a near certainty that the Conservatives would win this election, that the Liberals, after 9 years in power under Justin Trudeau, would be moving to the opposition benches. And in only a couple of months, that near certainty has been completely upended. And now the Liberals will again form the government, this time under the new Prime Minister Mark Carney. And simply put, I can't imagine how it feels to be in the Prime Minister's office this morning, nor can I imagine what it feels like to be at Conservative headquarters this morning. I mean, not only did the Conservatives lose an election that they were almost certain to win, but the leader of the Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, has lost his own seat. Again, this is remarkable. And this is, as you and I have talked about before, as I've written about before, this was an election fundamentally about not so much America, but about Donald Trump. And this is reflective in the polls. This is reflective in the ways in which the leaders campaigned. And this is a firm and solid rejection of what I think I'm fair in saying many, if not most, Canadians see as a profoundly hurtful betrayal of whom we, if I can use the first person, perceive to be our closest and most enduring ally.
Yeah, and President Trump tweeting Sunday night again about making Canada the 51st state and really twisting the knife in the back of Canadians. But again, I don't think it can be stated enough the historic nature of what's happened over the past few months in Canadian politics. Like being down more than 20 points and turning around and the Liberals winning has just been a shocking occurrence. But I think Mark Carney, I think, was also kind of the right man at the right time with his background. And because of, the nature of the US Canada relationship is going to be so much around issues of trade and economics and things like that, that I think having somebody like Carney at the helm, I think was somewhat reassuring to Canadians and what he's been able to do during the Great Recession and things like that, running the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England, I think spoke well of him. But it's going to be interesting. I think it also means that we are going to see a continuation of this antagonizing nature coming from the Washington, D.C. towards Canada, with the Liberals winning again. Carney's also going to have to get results because there are reasons that people were fed up with Justin Trudeau and the Liberals and their long time in power. So a lot to be done now that he's actually won.
Absolutely. And I do anticipate that the adversarial or at least antagonistic stance between Ottawa and Washington will carry on. On the one hand, the American president likes having an opponent. The politics of President Trump resemble the storylines of World Wrestling Entertainment. One needs a face, one needs a heel. And Donald Trump knows how to exploit these narratives for his political gain. He's been infamously successful at doing so. There's no reason why he would change in this respect. On the other hand, it also does serve Mark Carney, newly elected for the very first time in his life, elected into office in a popular vote. It does serve him to continue to have Donald Trump as a foil to parry and to position himself. So I don't see it abating anytime soon. I certainly hope that it does profoundly, but I think we're in this mess for the foreseeable future.
Well, regardless of what happens, Canada, we love you. And you're always our friendly neighbors to the north here at ISD.
Well, alors, merci beaucoup.
Yeah. All right, moving on. So last week, Vice President J.D. Vance visited India. We've talked about India quite a bit on the podcast over the course of the past couple of years. Hugely strategically important country, not just global politics and geopolitics, but within the US-China competition and where India situates itself, how it relates itself to China and the United States matters moving forward, not just in a defensive nature or from a strategic who's buying military hardware from who and who's doing naval exercises in the Indian Ocean with each other, but from a trade perspective as well, especially as the Trump administration pushes these tariffs and tries to reorient international trade in what it sees as a better position for the United States. The Trump administration originally had placed 27% tariffs on Indian exports to the United States before reversing its course a couple of weeks ago, and it put in place a 90-day pause. Now, of course, China still has the 145% tariffs on goods, but the US has been aggressively pushing this sort of friendshoring strategy, seeking to redirect supply chains away from China and toward allies like India, Japan, and many others. But these third-party countries aren't necessarily responding the way the United States is, because while we're trying to friendshore, we're also putting tariffs on these friends, which doesn't help trying to friendshore. So these countries are in a awkward position. And we've even seen the EU and sort of these countries in Western Europe that were strategically moving away from China over the course of the last 5 to 8 years because of the more nefarious nature of Chinese actions, and the EU and Europe and NATO's more aligning with the United States as seeing China as a strategic threat. Now the door is opening somewhat again to maybe increased trade and deals between China and Europe because of this. Where do you see this situating countries like India in particular?
Well, it is so difficult to say simply because the nature of US trade policy changes. Is it fair to say daily? At least weekly. This is something that you and I spoke about 2 weeks ago. And one of the things that makes this such I think I'm okay in saying a misstep for the current American administration is that the unpredictability is serving as an incentive to drive trade partners into what the Trump administration perceives to be the other camp, i.e., towards Beijing.
A more predictable camp.
Well, exactly. And China is able to make a argument that they have been making for years and years and years, now with unbelievably prescient evidence saying, look, we are predictable. You know exactly what you get with us. We can debate policies in terms of domestic politics all we want, but you know what you get out of us as a trading partner. The United States is not presently in a position to make that same argument. Let's take India. On the one hand, there is a difficult, strained relationship between New Delhi and Beijing. I mean, there are perennial border clashes between the two, I think most recently in 2020. But at the same time, bilateral trade between India and China reached a record 136 billion just 2 years ago. So there are these tensions there, but at the same time, there is an incredible gravity to China that is very, very difficult to, in and of itself, resist, given the current political climate. It is attractive. And so we are in this moment where I imagine in every capital, former or at least bruised trade partners of the United States are wondering, do we actually move towards Beijing now as a reliable trading partner? The absolute opposite intended effect to the Trump administration's policies.
Yeah, and as we've seen over the past few weeks, the markets despise unpredictability. Businesses despise unpredictability. If they're looking to invest hundreds of millions or billions into something, they want to know that the situation today is going to be similar in 3, 4, 5 years. And with what's going on right now, that's hard to predict. When you look at a country like India, that over the decades has been pragmatic and able to compartmentalize issues, maybe better than any other country. You just look at the relationship with Russia and what they've done
Precisely.
during the Ukraine war, working with the United States on multiple issues on one hand, but still purchasing arms from Russia, being a major outlet for sort of shadow market oil and things like that, and goods from Russia. So, they are able to separate out and do what's best for India. And that may mean deepening even more trade ties with China if there's a continued unpredictability from the United States. So something to keep our eye on, especially due to the importance that India will play in the region, already does, but will play most likely more so moving forward, and the relationship that the United States would like to have with India and it has sought for the past 2 decades now, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I was last in India for the G20 summit there in New Delhi at the end of 2023. And what was so evident was not just that the Indian government was pushing the line that India is on the rise, but that others around the table were recognizing exactly that fact. And so we will, I am sure, be returning to the question of not just India's relationship to China, but indeed India's relationship with the rest of the world and India's position as a trade partner, as a regional leader, as a security actor, I'm sure, time and time again.
All right. Well, lots of stuff to keep our eyes on moving forward. And hey, maybe next time when we get together, we might know who the new pope is. We'll see. We'll keep our eye on that, as will the entire world.
Absolutely. Another election for us to watch, but one that we get no exit polls for.
Yes. Yes. We can all go watch Conclave before our next episode. So that ends our news roundup. And now we move to our conversation on Romania with Dr. Remus Ștefureac. Remus is CEO and founder of INSCOP Research, one of the most respected polling firms in Romania. Previously, he was involved in the Foreign Service as a Romanian diplomat in Washington, D.C., and founded a strategic thinking group in 2005, a consulting company specialized in communication and public policy. Between 2009 and 2011, he was the advisor of the director of the Romanian Intelligence Service. His Ph.D. thesis covered the vast topic of Soviet political warfare, with a specific focus on Soviet-Romanian relations. Let's listen in to the conversation. All right, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to give you a little bit of a background and mini deep dive into the fascinating Romanian presidential elections that are happening right now. And with us today to talk about that is Remus Ștefureac. And Remus, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be back in contact with the American public. I left Washington, D.C. in 2019 after 4 years as a political counselor to Romanian embassy. And again, it's a pleasure to speak to you and, of course, the Georgetown community.
Yeah, and you're obviously a former diplomat and doing public polling now in Romania. And I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about this discussion today is the rapid rise of one of the previous candidates for this election. But we'll get to that in a minute. Just to kick things off, we're talking about this today because Romania is preparing for a presidential election on May 4th. There's probably going to be a second round scheduled for May 18th, a runoff. So for our listeners who aren't that familiar with or don't follow Romanian politics on a daily basis, could you walk us through who are the leading candidates right now and what are the 2 or 3 top concerns for voters in Romania right now?
So right now, of course, we are having, again, presidential elections after, let's say, an unprecedented story with our election back in November and December. But right now, we have 4 major contenders in these elections. We have George Simeon. He is, let's say, more radical, some are saying extremist, conservative, definitely pro-Russian candidate. But on the other hand, he presents himself as a pro-American. So I'm teaching a course tackling disinformation and building resilience. And whenever we are talking about disinformation, of course, there are different layers. And when we are talking about Russian propaganda, of course, there are different layers and there are people that are presenting themselves. Nice, beautiful view, always being pro-American, but of course, working for the other side. Beside that, again, he is a young candidate. He's rather new in politics. He's trying to present himself as a part of a new wave of politician, maybe similar with President Donald Trump. Of course, there are no similarities between the two of them, but this is a fashion now, and many people, not only in Romania, in the world, are trying to imitate President Trump. He's leading, again, a more extremist party, and he's leading in the polls for the first round. For our viewers, in Romania, we have 2 rounds of election. It's impossible to be elected in the first round because you need half of the entire population to vote for you, which is never happened because of the turnout. So we will have a second round. And we have another 3 contenders are fighting heavily. It's a very close competition for the second place in the second round, in the final.
The runoff is the top 2, correct?
Top 2.
Okay.
No matter the score, whoever are top 2 will go to the final. So the 3, let's say, contenders are Victor Ponta. He's running as an independent. He's a former prime minister of Romania, pretty close to, let's say, some figures from the Trump administration. Actually, we had yesterday a visit in Romania of Donald Trump Jr.
Oh, wow.
To an event, let's say a business event. Well, he's rather close to Victor Ponta. He used to be leader of the Social Democrats. Now he's out of this party. Again, as I mentioned, he's running as an independent, and he's trying to make a coalition of voters formed by Ph.D. Social Democrats, left-wing party voters, and some conservative, some more nationalistic voters. The third contender, very close. Again, we are talking about 3 contenders that are very close in the poll. It's very difficult for me to say now who will qualify in the second round because of the dynamic, and we will talk about the polls. It's Nicu Șordan. He's the mayor of Bucharest, the capital of Romania. He won the local elections in June for the second term with a very important score of almost 50%, which is a lot. I mean, it was a landslide victory for him. He used to be an NGO activist, promoter of anti-corruption messages, attitudes, and he's running as an independent, but supported by a progressive party. So he represents, let's say, the progressive movement in Romania. And the third contender, again, very close, it's Crin Antonescu. He had a long career in Romania back to the 90s. He retired from Romanian politics 10 years ago. He's the husband of a former EU commissioner for transport. He used to live in Brussels for a long time, 10 years, and now he returned and he's supported by three parties, the parties that are forming the government coalition, Ph.D, the Social Democrats, PNL, the Liberals, which are rather conservative. They are member of European Popular Party, so center-right party, center-right conservative parties from EU, and the party of the Hungarian minority. So these three parties are forming the government coalition now, and they are supporting this candidate who he used to be a liberal, but now he's kind of an independent. So the competition is very tough between these candidates. Of course, there are many topics. You asked about the topics. We discussed a lot about economical crisis. Social and economical factors are very relevant. We discussed a lot about the war. We are a frontier state of the European Union, very close to Ukraine. We helped a lot, and we are still helping a lot Ukraine. Crimea, it's less than 400 miles, so it's very close to our shore, very close to U.S. military base in Mihail Kogalniceanu in Constanța. It's on the Black Sea. You have there 2,000 U.S. soldiers, which are, of course, very important for the region. And again, the war, it's a very important topic. Also, other relevant topics are our position in the EU. The vast majority of the Romanians, 90%, 90, we conducted several polls recently, they reject the idea of a raw exit, leaving EU. They strongly reject the idea of leaving NATO. But on the other hand, they want a better position of Romania inside EU, a better performance from our politician in promoting our own interests. Of course, there is also a fashion, America first. Of course, we have Romania first.
Right.
So these are main elements, internal, economical, social, and related with foreign and security policy.
Yeah. Now, I want to get into the issues of sort of what the election might mean for the war in Ukraine, for NATO, and for EU in a minute, but let's back up. You mentioned the unprecedented election that you just had in November and December. And that election actually got annulled due to alleged foreign interference. The person that won that is no longer allowed to run in this election. So basically, what happened and how is Romania addressing these challenges? There's some that argue that the government overstepped, removing the candidate. There's others, obviously, that think that was the absolute correct thing to do because of what went down and how he gained relevance in such a short amount of time. So can you walk us through that a little bit?
So, of course, I will try to sum up what happened in Romania. It's unprecedented in any democracy in the world, and I think it will be a lesson. I hope that it will be a learned lesson for any democratic regime around the world. So we had that candidate who at the beginning of the campaign had the level of awareness, notoriety of 10-20%, which is very low for a presidential candidate. Before the start of the electoral campaign, he had a support in the polls of less than 3%. Before the start of the electoral campaign, we had two candidates that run on this lane of more radical, more nationalistic, more extremist message. We had two candidates, one, George Simion, who is running now, and another lady, very, I would say, neo-fascist, Diana Șoșoacă. Together, they had in polls around 30%, 30. Our constitutional court decided that Șoșoacă could not run because of her anti-Semitic statements. And I think it was a fair decision of the constitutional court. You cannot run for office if you support strongly former fascist policies. I think it was the right decision for our defense. So with Diana Șoșoacă out, of course, Mr. Georgescu had an opportunity open because Diana Șoșoacă had the support of 15% before the electoral campaign. So in our first evaluation of Mr. Georgescu, he had around 6%. In the last week of the electoral campaign, our polls identified support of 11-12% for Mr. Georgescu, still far from the 21-22.
Yeah.
And of course, we conducted the poll during the day of the elections, and we identified before the final results a support for him of 20%, so pretty close to the final. So what happened in the last, let's say, 2 weeks, and mainly in the last week, and especially in the last 3 days of elections? This was the mystery in, let's say, in November, in December, maybe in January. Now we know the whole story from intelligence agency, from Romania, from France, from Italy. Also, we know the full story from a TikTok report that was published 3 weeks ago. It was an unprecedented operation of foreign meddling, and I'm quoting from the TikTok official report. European Union asked TikTok to explain what happened and what happened with the incredible rise of visibility of the accounts and the narratives and the messages of only one candidate, this candidate, Călin Georgescu. And from TikTok report, I'm quoting, they identified 27,000 fake accounts, several bots farms that were located in several cities in Turkey, operating under Russian domains. Again, I'm quoting from TikTok. And they managed to send in the last 24 hours before the election day 2.5 comments on accounts that were supporting Călin Georgescu. According to TikTok algorithm, if you have many comments, you will have a rise of visibility. And of course, this was one of the main explanations for the rise of Călin Georgescu, but it's not the only part of the story. You cannot have a huge rise of support for a candidate unless you have a social ferment in the society, something concrete. Otherwise, we can design an operation to Kelly to be a very popular leader, but maybe you'll not be because in US, people are talking about something else. So in Romania, of course, we have a lot of people that were unhappy with the government, especially after the pandemic, especially during the economic crisis, consequences of the war. So a lot of people that didn't benefit from EU accession, low level of income, low education, and the messages of Mr. Georgescu resonated a lot with young, poor voters, with voters from rural areas, with voters from smaller cities, with low income. It's probably a familiar story.
Yeah, totally familiar.
But when you have such an operation designed very specifically on social media, especially because he wasn't visible in mainstream media, he didn't engage in debate, only on social media, only with messages that were very short, in a very controlled manner, in a very safe environment, without any debate. Not so he was strongly pro-Russian, but he didn't mention his pro-Russian stances too much. He was mainly anti-corruption, criticizing the governments in the last 35 years. Of course, after we saw the amazing results, of course, mainly media, but not only media, regular citizens digged a lot in his previous statements, and we discovered a guy that, for example, he is saying that US never landed on the moon, fake, a lot of conspiracies. He was very active, he and Simeon, during the pandemic, supporting an anti-vaccination campaign very strongly. He is saying that if you are drinking Pepsi Cola, you could ingest nanochips. A lot of crazy stories. But of course, even the voters found out about this aspect after the vote, because again, they weren't very visible. The only visible messages of his campaign was those very controlled anti-system, anti-corruption messages. So maybe it brings a little bit of light in the story. But this is what happened in Romania, again, with a very strong disinformation campaign. And I'm teaching disinformation. The Russians are conducting a large disinformation campaign in a lot of EU countries, Romania included. They will not be successful with a pro-Russian narrative, but they will be successful with this idea that, one of the main idea, Romania is the colony of EU and US. Of course, when you are talking about this type of narrative, you could gain some traction, some success. It's not a new story. It's something similar with the measures applied like in the 80s, 70s. My Ph.D. is focused exactly on the Soviet active measures. So I documented a lot on this topic, and especially on the ways of how, let's say, Russian disinformation and intelligence apparatus tried to influence elections in different countries.
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep telling this story too, because a lot of people in America think that, that happened in 2016 in the US, but then we've kind of stopped that and they just think it's gone. And like that Russia doesn't continue to do this, but they're, continually acting to try to muddy the waters in democracies all over the place, but especially in the EU, and divide populations within the EU. And not, like you said, not necessarily making them pro-Russian, but just dividing them and making things difficult for the governments making democracy look bad and things like that.
Just to be clear regarding the polling again was right. And again, I have a lot of experience conducting polls since 2013. And actually, a funny story, when there is a close competition, always it's complicated as we have now for the second place in the second round. I remember that back in 2016, I was in DC as a political counselor. And I think we were one of the only embassies that sent a cable back home saying that, well, Mr. Trump might win this election. And it was a risk. But again, assessing all the data, seeing that, a lot of people didn't express their real opinion. Our estimation back then was that maybe Mr. Trump has a fair chance actually to win elections against Hillary Clinton. It happened like that. In a close election, of course, polls are useful instruments, but they are not absolute in terms of forecasting. As we have now in Romania, it's a close competition. And I hope that we will not have to follow a similar story with another TikTok or Facebook or whatever operation, so that we measure something and next day we don't know that temperature on social media is high on some mysterious guy. We don't see that now. TikTok announced that they have an pretty important team of around 100 operators, Romanian-speaking people that are monitoring what is happening. But we have to see what happened in Romania in November. It happened in the last 4 days. So,
well, but I think, knowing what happened last time and having TikTok, it sounds like they're doing something to better prepare for this. So that goes a long way to try to make that more difficult for nefarious actors. I said we'd get back to the EU and NATO and Ukraine and stuff. So what are the stakes in this election for Romania's relationship with the EU or potential relationship writ large with other European countries, with the United States? If Simeon wins, for instance, what does that look like? If one of the more centrist parties wins and independent candidates, what does that look like?
well, we have to, first of all, we have to look at, as you do in US, at the Constitution. And if we analyze the Constitution, we will discover that the powers of the Romanian president are not so great compared to the powers of the mighty US president, according to your Constitution. So even if pro-Russian candidate would win elections, he will not be able to do too much in order to shift, let's say, the strategic position of Romania. First, we have a pro-European, pro-US, pro-American majority in the parliament. And this majority cannot be overrun by a president. The president doesn't have constitutional powers to take down the government, which is very relevant. On the other hand, as I mentioned, the population, 90% of the population are rejecting any idea of a raw exit from NATO. It's unacceptable for us. We conducted, for example, actually recently, I published today some figures. We have 75% of the Romanians that are saying that it's very important for Romania to have a close relation with Trump administration that is running now US. This was the wording, because we wanted to include in the wording Trump administration. Having all the debates in the entire world, in Romania also. So it's a strong support for the close ties between Romania and US because of many historical and, of course, security aspects. So the president, no matter his name, will not be able to strategically shift Romania. But a pro-Russian president, let's say, of course, he can do a lot of harm. We have some pro-Russian figures in EU. We're talking about Viktor Orban. We're talking in Hungary. We're talking in Slovakia. And of course, sometimes they are blocking decision. They are trying to support policies that are in favor of Russia. But I don't think that a pro-Russian president would be very successful. According to our constitution, of course, we also have the possibility to suspend and to send the president back home. Especially, we can organize a referendum, and if the people will decide that this president has to go home, he will go home. And if a Romanian president would support openly pro-Russian policies, he will go home.
Yeah.
Because the political parties will say that, not because an agency will say that, because the people will not accept it. Maybe the students and the Georgetown committee should understand that in the last 200 years, we faced 12 Russian Soviet invasions. For us, Russian Soviets are, let's say, the bad news. It's impossible to, and it's in our, I identity DNA. It's in our cultural DNA. It's in our history. Even during the communist regime, we had a national communism approach. Actually, we were the only country in the Soviet bloc, in the Warsaw bloc, that had an agreement with MIF for funds to support the development of our industry. It was against the Soviet view. And I think were the only country in Eastern Bloc visited by 2 US presidents, and we have Romanian communist president that visited US. So we always had this reluctant attitude towards Russia.
Well, as a historian, I love bringing in some deep history to this. So I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. I know you need to go watch a presidential debate. So we'll keep an eye on this and update our listeners as to what transpires. So Remus, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again to Remus for his time and thoughts. And thank you for listening to this episode of Headlines and History. This show is produced by Freddie Mallinson and Theo Malhotra. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @GUDiplomacy and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.